Good afternoon, everyone, and on behalf of the Human Rights Center, welcome, and thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. Today, we are honored to host Richard Buxbaum and Adam Hochschild in conversation on the 60th anniversary of the free speech movement. In addition to being incredibly important people in their respective fields, both of these people are near and dear to the hearts of us here at the Human Rights Center. Richard has been an ally of the center since it was founded over 30 years ago and has been a great friend to us. He and Adam both are members of our advisory board and we're honored by their friendship. Dick Buxbaum has many legacies here on campus. One special one for us is the new Buxbaum Global Justice Fellowship, which we named in his honor. Each year, the fellowship is awarded to one or more recent graduates or current students to conduct investigations or research at the Human Rights Center. The award gives emerging talent the opportunity to work on meaningful issues and to help launch their careers in human rights. Through their work, we hope to continue Professor Buxbaum's legacy of mentorship, impact, and action. The very first recipient of the Buxbaum Fellowship is our own open source investigations training manager, Brian Nguyen, and we've asked him to introduce our speakers this evening. Please welcome Brian Nguyen.
Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Brian Nguyen, and I'm honored to be the first recipient of the Richard Buxbaum Global Justice Fellowship. Tonight, we gather together to celebrate the legacy of the free speech movement, a pivotal movement that reshaped the landscape of student rights and expression, and to honor one of its most dedicated stewards, Professor Richard Buxbaum. 60 years ago, Professor Buxbaum had just begun his career at Berkeley Law when hundreds of students took over Sproul Hall, just a few minutes from here, to protest against restrictions on free speech and political action on campus. For a day and a half, students studied, sang, and participated in teach-ins, standing firm in their commitment to justice, until police raided the peaceful protest with the backing of the governor and arrested nearly 800 people. In that pivotal moment, Professor Buxbaum stepped forward, serving as defense counsel for all 773 people targeted, championing their rights and holding officials and administrators accountable. A year later, the administration passed new rules allowing for the promotion of free speech on campus. A few years later, he would represent several campus organizations in cases arising out of Vietnam War protests and act as defense counsel in criminal proceedings that accompanied the Third World Liberation Front strikes, a multi-ethnic campus coalition protesting Eurocentric curriculum that ultimately led to the development of affirmative action programs for student admissions. Professor Buxbaum then went on to direct Berkeley Law's Institute for Legal Research, helped found the National Housing Law Project, and lay the groundwork for reparations for Holocaust survivors. These are just a few of his extraordinary accomplishments, reflecting both his dedication to his students as well as his unwavering commitment to justice and public service. His legacy is a powerful example of the impact we can all have when we fight for the rights of those around us and the difference we can make when we stand up for the dignity of others. Tonight, author and UC Berkeley Journalism lecturer and esteemed author Adam Hochschild will engage Professor Buxbaum in a conversation that explores the historical significance of the free speech movement and its lasting impact on our society. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Well, thank you. And welcome to all of you who are here and to all of you who are watching on Zoom. It's good to have you with us, even if remotely. It's a real pleasure and honor for me to be here. I've known Dick Buxbaum for some years through being on the Human Rights Center Advisory Board with him. If this were appropriately designed, this evening would be about 3 or 4 hours long to cover all of the things that he's done in his life. But we're going to try to cram it into an hour or so. One of the reasons we're here is to celebrate the free speech movement, its 60th anniversary. At first I thought that 60th anniversary must be a mistake and that it was only the 50th anniversary, but then I added it up and it really is 60 years. Just curious, can we see a show of hands of veterans of the free speech movement in the room? Okay. Good. Well, congratulations to all of you. You took part in something tremendously important. But Dick, I want to begin with you because you had, in your early life, some direct contact with what the lack of free speech and the lack of freedom meant because you grew up in Nazi Germany. So you came up against that firsthand. What was that like? Tell us a little bit about your life there.
Well, considering that I was 8 years old when we left, infantile memories are even more precarious than adult ones. So let me just say, I'm not Jewish by Jewish law. I'm Jewish by fate, and also by faith, not faith. But my mother was not Jewish. My father was, and the three of us were raised as Jews, went to Jewish grammar schools, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, we shared that of the full Jews. I have to say, the village into which we moved when I was 9 months old was a very progressive, in a sense, village, in the sense it had the highest proportion of social democrats and the left-wing social democrats. There were two sets of social democrats in the Hessian region, partly because it was a kind of a market tender town. If you have ever watched Mother Courage by Brecht, she is an epitome of the kind of women that were serving in that function. So it had the lowest vote, for example, for the National Socialist Party in all of Hessen, the only one under 20%. Now, I have to add something here which you haven't asked, but I'm going to say it. The vote for the party was not very high in any of southern Germany, even in Munich, the home of the, Hofbrauhaus, Putsch, and so on and so forth. It was in the north and northeast, Pomerania and sort of Bismarck's territory, where the heaviest vote for Hitler and his ilk came about. So there was a certain amount of this kind of resistance even then, and that was visible even to a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old in our village. Yeah.
How was it visible? What did you see?
Well, there were, of course, every fourth Sunday the SA paraded through the town, and that was standard in all towns. And they paraded almost through an empty set of streets. Nobody wanted to go out and cheer them, and nobody wanted to go out and boo them because that had consequences too. So they were just left to walk on their own. My father used to comment how nice that they can go here in perfect safety.
Any thoughts from those first 8 years in Germany that might apply to the United States today? You saw a reasonably democratic country become an undemocratic one very, very quickly. Many of us are afraid the same thing, we're at risk of the same thing happening here.
Again, when you say you saw, I mean, what did I see as a 4-year-old or a 6-year-old or even an 8-year-old? I would say my consciousness about the Nazi regime and what was going on started in 1936. My father, who was a country doctor and from the region, and he was the only doctor in the village, had already been kicked out of the quasi-socialized medicine system, the Krankenkasse system, as a Jew. And he was able to keep his practice going because the mayor allowed him to take over a still existing but non-functioning insurance company. In the old days, a village would have mutual fire insurance. In Bismarck's day, of course, that became a state function, so these old ones were no longer needed, but they were still in existence. So he took that over, And where I became conscious about it was that at age 6, well, I have to back up. Nobody paid, unless by accident, at the doctor's office. They did, the Krankenkasse system was a tax. You paid your tax, but for that you got service, medical service. And his personal Krankenkasse, which he set up, because he was the only doctor there and he was encouraged to do so, was the same thing. And it is really amazing that the villagers paid 2 taxes. I mean, they had to pay the state tax, they didn't get out of that, right? But they also paid his tax, so to say, give him free service. I remember it well, 1 Reichsmark 25 Pfennig per household per month. And when I was 6 years old, he gave me a ledger and a heavy pencil and a pouch. And I walked the village and collected the monthly tax. If there was a check against them already, that meant they had happened to come to the office that month. So I wouldn't go there. That was too bad because I got a lot of sausage breads. I mean, almost every house offered something. I enjoyed that monthly walk. I mean, I was 6 years old, 7 years old. Who wouldn't? Yeah.
That suggests if you want to collect debts, you should send a 6-year-old child out to do it for you. Then you came to the United States. Your dad became a doctor on an Indian reservation in upstate New York. Did that bring you into contact with that element of American life?
Oh, very much. Most Jewish doctors and left communist or socialist doctors had left Germany in 1933 because they had lost this socialized medicine eligibility. Some of the wealthy, or some of the ones who had private practices in big cities, which were, of course, wealthier patients, didn't leave, but most had left. So the whole system in that context was different. But because he had his own private practice, and because he was local and a country doctor, well liked, he had a living. Even after 1936, when it became it was a penal violation for a Jewish doctor to treat an Aryan patient and vice versa. I didn't know this personally, but he told me as we moved to the United States that the mayor, that the local Gauleiter, the party had sort of a chief in each village, had said, all right, we'll close one eye, but you have to do this after dark. You can't open your practice until like 6 p.m. So he kept going almost too long. So we didn't leave until the end of 1938, after the pogroms, the Crystal Night.
Then you came to the United States, and then he was a doctor on an Indian reservation.
Yes.
And did you see some of that world through his eyes?
Oh, very much. I mean, by then I was, of course, going to school. The school I was going to it's odd that the name of the village was Bombay, New York, but these were not South Asian Indians. They were local tribes, Mohawk, the only Mohawk nation. There's only one tribe in the Mohawk Nation, that was the St. Regis tribe, Akwesasne now. So, I went to a local school. Most of the students were, in fact, from the reservation. And so that became quite natural. Yeah. And I'll have to say, that was much faster assimilation into the United States than most of the doctors who ended up in the Fourth Reich in Upper Manhattan, and tried to make a living among their own with their own competition with each other. Yeah. He had no competition.
Skipping ahead a little bit, after college, law school, you went back to Germany, first in the army, right? And was it when you were in the army that you were engaged in the negotiation about reparations, or did that come later?
No, that came much later. What I did do in the army, though, was work. I was in the European headquarters in Heidelberg of the U.S. Army, and because I was bilingual, I was made the liaison of the army to the German judiciary. So that was a different kind of activity, right? with the NATO Status of Forces Agreement that came into power in 1955, when the treaty with Germany, made them independent other than Berlin, the criminal jurisdiction over servicemen and women was split depending on where the crime was committed. If it was committed on the base, the U.S. Army had, and I was the prosecutor at that. But off the base, the German Ministry of Justice and district attorneys, you might say, had the prior right. And one of my rather odd jobs was to wait about 2 weeks until the newspaper excitement about a particular crime had died down, and then go to that prosecutor and say, we could save you a lot of time and a lot of money, all that interpretation crap, if you would waive jurisdiction and allow us to prosecute them ourselves. I'm not proud of that, because one of my mantras was, we're harder than you. We give harder sentences. I'm ashamed to say that now. Well, not very ashamed, but it just happened.
And then when did your work on reparations come, and what did that involve?
That was much later. It was really in around 1990 when as you know, the principal compensation for property takings, restitution, and so on, started, of course, already under the military regime from 1947 on. One of the conditions of Germany gaining sovereignty in 1955 was that the Germans had to pass statutes at least as generous as the Allied ordinances when it came to such things as compensation for the loss of life, health, loss of opportunity, and so on and so forth. So that was something we were involved with. In fact, even for our own family, these were relevant things. But the one you're talking about, Adam, that came about not because of the fate of the Jews, but the fate of all of the 8 million involuntary laborers whom the Germans dragooned or shanghaied and pulled into Germany as their workforce during World War II. So there were many, many class actions brought in the United States against most German companies, and it was pretty clear after a while that this was going to have to take some heavy mediation. And so Stuart Eisenstadt, senior official in the State Department, and Otto Count Lambsdorff, who was a senior minister there, they agreed to try to create some mediation about this. So there was formed a foundation under German law, but under treaty with the United States. So this foundation had a treaty base, and it was a foundation for remembrance, responsibility, and the future. And that was where my heavy work then started in 1991. I was one of the 3 members of the so-called Property Commission, which had about €1 billion, not enough, of course, to try to compensate people in the East whose productive enterprises had been confiscated by the Germans. And that was where my heavy work came in. Yeah.
Does that suggest any kind of guidelines or principles that you would apply to the debates going on about reparations in the United States today? Reparations for slavery and how black Americans have been treated since slavery ended.
Well, first of all, of course, we had the issue of reparations for Japanese Americans who were interned. We had a little bit, not very much, for the Italian Americans who had been interned in other countries, but by order of the United States. That's a little known factoid, but that also happened, right? But the issue of slavery, the principal difference is, of course, the difference between 20 years and 120 years. So the question really was not so much that there shouldn't be, but what did reparations mean in this context? And there were, as I'm sure many of you remember, debates in the United States on this. Charles Ogilvy at Harvard, Mary Marable at Columbia, they were pushing for, especially Marable, for investment in the black ghettos, of the large cities, better schools, better services, and so forth. The notion of the modern equivalent of 40 acres and a mule was not as much in the forefront. Interestingly, now, it is kind of interesting, we have some efforts at pretty minimal, I would say, a monetary compensation like that, but the facts on the ground on that are very complicated. As to who is a descendant, of slavery, who came from the West Indies and so forth. San Francisco is just beginning now to work on the details of this.
Any suggestions about general principles that a reparations plan should follow?
Well, given the numbers and given the budgets, I don't find that handing out cash or the equivalent, right, of a necessarily rather low amount to the descendants 5 generations down is as sensible as what Marable proposed, which was to invest in the still residential segregation and educational disparities and so on. And that, I think, is what would make more sense. That's my personal view. Now, in the 70s, when this was first broached, Boris Bitker at Yale wrote a very interesting book about the right to reparations, but then also, at that time, pardon me, what kind of reparations. So that's been more an issue, but it's high again now. Interesting. Yeah.
Okay. Why don't we move on to a central topic today, the free speech movement, and just roll the clock back to that day, roughly 60 years ago. Actually, it would be 60 years ago in December when the big arrest took place. Just to take a little personal detour here, I was actually outside Sproul Hall as a reporter at the time that the arrest was taking place, and local police officers and California highway patrolmen and so on were walking or dragging those nearly 800 people to take them away. And I just this morning went to find the article that I'd written about it, hoping that I would have been wise enough to say this was a momentous history-making event which was going to be certain to change the complexion of the country in the years ahead. Instead, I found the most interesting thing was a letter to the editor that someone had written objecting to my story. And I'll just read a few paragraphs from it, because it sort of raises some issues that are with us today. Dear editor, whether you know it or not, you have a communist dupe on your paper. In the article last Friday about the riots at the University of California, your reporter, Adam Hochschild, showed himself to be pretty naive about what's going on up there. What about the quality of the student who's going to be in these activities? What about the leftists and beatniks? Are they the kind of people this country ought to be proud of? This is all the whole crumbling down of law and order which is undermining this generation of America. It's not just criminals who are out there on the streets stirring up trouble. It's college kids too, and if we don't watch out, it might be all of us.
It's the enemy within.
The enemy within. So that's exactly the point that I wanted to make, that, we have that kind of rhetoric still going on today. What are your thoughts about that, Dick, as you hear something like what was said in Madison Square Garden a couple of nights ago?
Well, we can't call them, of course it's a terrible slander to call somebody a geriatric syphilitic, but in other terms, somebody did that in a newspaper article not long ago, in fact a couple of weeks ago. But you could certainly worry about his disinhibitions, right? But the parallel, if you're looking at the parallel to Germany, I have a little difficulty knowing how a country of this size and this disparity, right, can really be trapped in that. I mean, there is, if Trump wins, we're going to have a worse time than the last time. But I am not one of those who sees an inevitable ramp that's greased to take us down to the abyss. You know. I think that's a soup that's eaten rather not as hot as it's cooked in my book. I'm not. I mean, I hate to see what's going to happen, and certainly the Charter 2025 is a very nasty thing to be looking at like this. But there are other. The institutions are at risk because, of course, of the tremendous inability to convince a 30% of the population, well, actually less than that, 30% maybe, about 50% of the Republican Party members about this. I have no crystal ball on this. I just feel that compared with how Europe went down the drain, in the 30s, I don't think it's a direct comparison. Not direct. I mean, there are troubles, but it's different.
So you say the institutions are stronger. You're thinking about the court system, about the federal system. What institutions in particular?
I think federalism is one of the biggest variations on the theme of Europe in this sense. I mean, sure, Germany had Länder, but that meant nothing, in terms of how the Nazi Party took over. And because there, every land was simply seized by the party. There was no difference between Pomerania and Saxony in that regard. That isn't going to be the case here. I mean, the leadership or the electorate in some states is going to be different. Now, I am, like everybody, I'm very worried about the House shifting, staying Republican and the Senate shifting. But I mean, the comparison is a little different to me. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because of the federal system.
That's a large part of it.
And the court system?
Well, I would have said that 15 years ago. I'm a little less happy about that now. Although in this context, not in the context of religion and so on, but in this context, the worst case is, of course, the immunity, presidential immunity case. But of course, if Trump wins, that will be luckily a moot opinion.
Yeah.
They'll have gotten away with writing something that had no consequences.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's go back to the free speech movement. So the arrest took place December 1964. You found yourself the next day at Santa Rita, or was that day where you were?
Well, in the morning.
Yeah.
The arrest took about from midnight to 4 a.m.
Yeah.
And so on. Well, I was like the frog. And by the way, there were 5 defense counsel, and in fact, a 6th who couldn't be called that because he wasn't a member of the bar yet. So he served up. What happened was one of our third-year students, Michael Nassatir, called me in the morning. He said his girlfriend and several members of her sorority had gone into Sproul. The Pied Piper had let them in, and they were now out at Santa Rita. Would I be good enough to go and get those 3 girls? And that's where it started. And from there on, it just like a frog. Then of course you had a representative at the first arraignment, and then others wanted it, and finally they needed a faculty member as part of the defense team. They had a very mixed defense team. 2, what of course Coakley called communists. 1, in fact, had been Norman Leonard. 2 left-wingers, 2 soft lefties, pinks, right? Henry Elson and Stanley Gold, who had been a partner of the judge, and the academic fig leaf, that was me. So that's how the 5 got appointed. Yeah.
So what was
and
that?
I took it on. Yeah.
Yeah. So what was that experience like? So you represented the whole group during the trial. tell us about the trial.
Okay, now, I have to be clear about this. In legal technique terms, it was a disaster. In outcomes, it wasn't horrible, except for the 7 leaders who served between 3 to 6 months in jail. And the reason is, we started, of course, with 773 arrestees. Under California law, the highest number of people who had engaged in a common enterprise that you could bring the case against in one case was 10. So this meant the prosecution was going to have 77 plus trials. On the other hand, we were 5 people. We had other lives too. We were not professional defense counsel, and there was no money in this anyway, in that sense. And secondly, we knew very well that the prosecution wasn't going to be stupid about this. The first 10 would be the leaders, right? They would get heavy sentences. There was no doubt about that if they were convicted, and they would be convicted. I mean, none of us as lawyers had much. We had hopes that resisting arrest charge could be defeated. I didn't, but some of the colleagues said, lying down and not moving is just as resistant as pushing against it. That's unfortunately had been already the case, you know. But the problem was that once 7 or 8 of these leaders had been given their 6 months in jail, then they wouldn't give a damn about the others. And that's what the group as a whole would not stand for. That was really highly creditable, right? They met in a church, they met in the Veterans Auditorium and so on. And unlike most defendants who can be controlled by their lawyers in a criminal case, we had to take whatever they decided, and that was okay in a sense, because it was as much political as it was legal. So they decided, no, unless everybody gets the same sentence, none of us is going to plead guilty. Well, all right, now what? You know? And then the worst possible compromise was reached. A representative sample of 125 of the 773 was to be picked. The prosecution had the right to have some of their choices put in there, so of course they picked the leaders and a couple of the particularly scruffy defendants who wouldn't make. It was not a jury trial. That was the other thing that we, of course, put in mostly nice young people, well coiffed, you know, and so forth. This didn't matter in the least because it was all before a judge, not a jury. So these 125 became, and then of course the others all signed a guarantee which was totally worthless and could never have been enforced, that they would accept the conviction and sentence that was put on these 125 people. Right? Now, that everybody knew that anybody who wanted to finesse that later could. That was impossible as a contract, right, Frank? Impossible. Right? But that's what was signed. Right? And so there were these choices. And then what happened, of course, was everybody was, every newspaper, all journalists, everybody was in the courtroom in the old Veterans Auditorium on Addison Street, on Center Street, on the first day. Right? And the district attorney of Alameda County, who was a hack named Coakley, I mean, okay lawyer, but he was not the Earl Warren, who was the original, who was the first district attorney I knew of Alameda County or others. He came up and did a very nice fiery opening statement and then was never seen again until Mario Savio was on the stand. For that he came back because all the reporters came back. For the rest of it, the main problem the judge had was haranguing us that, listen, 125 are on trial here. How come there are only 18 here? I'm postponing today's proceeding until I see at least 45 to 50 people. So then we had to go out on a telephone tree and get people to come. Right? So it turned into a kind of an odd farce, you know, in this regard, and it just descended slowly, you know, into boredom. The judge was bored, the defense counsel were bored, and so on. Right? The newspaper reporters were so bored they left. You know, there was nothing going on. Then, of course, on cross-examination, when you had some big deals like Karakura was brought in, and he had to be cross-examined, yeah, you got a little more. The students wanted to, I mean, the defendants wanted to see this too, right? And the public wanted to see it, and the press wanted to see it. So we'd have one or two peaks like this, and for the rest, it was always, get more people here, or I'm postponing it till tomorrow. Yeah.
Who was the judge? And
Rupert Crittenden, a decent guy, and it was talking about conflict of interest. His former law partner, Stanley Gold, had been picked by Mal Bernstein to be one of the 5 defense counsel. So it was a rather familiar situation, and poor Stan Gold had a very hard time remembering to say, Your Honor. More than once he said, Rup, you can't do that. Yeah. I'm making it too funny, and it isn't really funny, but you know, it was not a trial in any sense that we read about, you know, in that sense.
So the result of it was sentences of some months for a small group of police,
yes.
Right?
And we knew that would happen, right? So it didn't matter. They were guilty on all 3 counts. Resisting arrest, failure to obey a lawful order, and failure to disperse on some ground. And it started quite calmly, and the first 10 people came to be sentenced. Now, they were sentenced 10 at a time per day. And the first 10 came and said, yes, we plead guilty. And he gave them 10 days in jail, but on probation. And the probation was technically illegal because, well, he said, but you'll violate the probation if you do any illegal acts like reassembling. Well, that's a First Amendment issue that wasn't quite kosher, but it was understood. On the 3rd day, a graduate student, something Duke, suddenly blew up the whole situation. He said, given that we are about to go into a war in Vietnam, and of course this is now 1965, and the war had started, right? I cannot accept any plea which would inhibit my being able to work against this atrocity that is developing. And from that day on, less than 10% of the students pleaded guilty. That was really interesting, and every time they did, they made a point of having an extra reason. And they had reasons. I mean, the few who did plead guilty. But this was just amazing, you know, that it turned the whole thing into something that the judge hadn't wanted. What are you going to do now? Well, now he sentences them to 30 days in Santa Rita. 30 days is not horrible, but he didn't want to do that. You know, he wanted to give them 10 days on probation, except for the people coming up who were going to get 3 or 4 months. Yeah.
What do you feel, looking back on the case now, that the case, the trial, and the free speech movement itself established in terms of the expectation of rights of free speech that students would have on campus, and that everybody would have on campus?
Adam, let me start on that with a sort of not a fancy thing, but Frank Zappa. I don't know who remembers who Frank Zappa was. Frank Zappa once said, "If you understand the significance of something you're involved in, you're not experiencing it." And if that's the definition, then we were experiencing it, because I would say nobody saw ahead, you know, what now in retrospect is everybody knows and has written about and so forth. I don't know whether 3 or 4 of us, like Michael, you know, whether you have any, later maybe I'd like to hear how you see that. But we didn't foresee, anything except Vietnam. Now it was clear that there was going to be student unrest, there was going to be faculty unrest, there was going to be national unrest. It was never a popular war, believe me, and many of you know this, right? So it was a forecast that was coming. The other things that were coming were, of course, stronger and to some degree a little less justifiable things, like the invasion and occupation of Moses Hall. They had to be dragged out of that, and they were charged, and they were charged a bit higher. Those a little bit like today. When the anti-Israel encampments move inside, even a liberal chancellor is duty-bound, you might say, to see to it that they are removed. Right? So that is what happened later. Moses Hall happened. Eldridge Cleaver came along, and with his power is at the point of a bayonet, and so forth, and held forth here in Berkeley, and that led to further troubles of that sort. And of course, the Black Panther movement started, which was a quite misunderstood movement, I might say, because it started as a communal help organization, and the show of force was usually just that. I mean, a kind of a parade of forces. I don't want to trivialize it, because later ugly things happened, including some killings and so forth. But it wasn't a heavy thing. But all of these things, of course, put the free speech movement into the shadows. Right? The only thing that the free speech movement did, according to a few people, is elevate Ronald Reagan to the presidency. That was Mike Hayman's view. That's what its main consequence was.
But wouldn't you give it more credit than that?
Of course it had more reason and more meaning, but it also had some of these consequences. Pushback and blowback are real. That's a fact of life too.
Yeah. I think it's time to see if people in the audience have questions and comments. And Alexi, you've got a mic to take around. So if you've got comments, raise your hand. And David.
Two questions. Dick, as I recall, in '64, there were a number of faculty who had come from Germany, many from different parts of Europe. I'm thinking of Tarski, the logician, and Landauer, the economist. I don't recall how intense it was, but my impression is that there was a lot of displeasure on the part of the emigres, and feeling that those of us that were in these movements were creating sort of brown shirt type atmosphere. I wonder if you could explain a little bit how that felt, since you'd had this European experience. And then second, if I may, you haven't mentioned the letters that the arrestees wrote to Judge Crittenden. And since historians, when they talk about the free speech movement, make a lot of those letters as testimony as to what the character of the movement was. So if you could say something about those letters, I'd appreciate that.
Well, take the letters first. They were everybody's individual views, but of course there was a lot of similarity, in it. And again, the letters were coming and in the shadow of the Vietnam War. So a lot of the letters tied these things together, and for good reason. And you have to remember what a problem it was on campuses as to when the draft started hitting with Vietnam, which was a little later. The draft hadn't started in '64 heavily for that. So that part, I think, was understandable, and they are worth reading, right? When it comes to the mainly Jewish and some communist and socialist faculty members, they of course had all been blooded, by the mob scenes in universities. You have to remember that the earliest showing of force, other than the SA in the first few months, before Hitler pushed it down a bit, the main shows of forces were at the universities, where the German students wouldn't allow professors to speak. Now, of course, Jewish professors had already been removed, but there were, of course, socialists and other professors. Hans Kelsen, as you know, moved first out and then moved to Czechoslovakia, thinking Prague would be better. It wasn't. They had the Sudetendeutsch in Prague, and they beleaguered him. He told us quite frightening stories when we got to know him here about his treatment, there. So people like Landauer and Rosenberg and so forth, all they saw here was a replica of what they had experienced in those bad years, 36, 37, 38. And I knew them well, and I would speak a lot with them about, no, this is not that. This is not at all what you remember. This is not an anti-democracy situation. And slowly some saw that. But Louis Foyer, the philosopher, he moved to Toronto. He said, I'm not going to be at a university that gets down into the brown shirt mob scene, right? And even as clear a man as Reinhard Bendix, he moved from sociology, where the professors were mostly voted yes, on the famous vote on the time, place, and manner regulations, which we haven't talked about. That happened afterwards.
You might just pause and explain what that was.
Well, the administration, the campus administration, which had always been a day late and a dollar short, I mean, it was just amazing how they never caught up, so to say, with what was happening. It was understandable, well, I won't go into that, but dollar late, dollar short and a day late is, I think, fair. I really do. Anyway, they had tried to, bring some rational grounding after the fact to the story, and so and so we had this famous mass meeting of the faculty at Wheeler Auditorium, at which first the administration, through our own colleague Adrian Cragen, who later became a great defender of the university, tried to put forward a motion that would condemn the free speech movement, not condemn in horrible terms, but would condemn it as violations of basic understandings of the relationship between students, faculty, and administration. And our late colleague, Professor Jennings, was the chair. And the faculty there, over 800 of them, which you'll never get to another faculty meeting unless you have another crisis, voted against that resolution. And then the liberals, Heyman, Robert Cole, and so forth, put theirs forward, which was a time, place, and manner resolution. And that passed, and of course the students were outside, and it was being mic'd to the plaza outside Wheeler, and they were so happy that the faculty was with them. But it was a perfectly understandable statement. They weren't saying that people hadn't violated the law, whatever the law was. They were saying that free speech had to be allowed, and time, place, and manner regulations were a viable way of harmonizing it with the requirements of a university, of a classroom, of a laboratory, and so on and so forth. That's what the place was really the most important thing. What you could do on Sproul Plaza, yelling even hate things, right? You couldn't do any of that, of course, inside a classroom. And today, that's the main thing we know, is what is it that you can do in terms of contrary opinions. A lot of people think the woke culture is so soft that they cannot take even a gently voiced opposition. A conservative student doesn't dare speak is the mantra today, in this sense. But at that time, these were new. There had been no such framework. Right? Cole, Robert Post, who went on to Yale, and even Adrian Cragen helped a bit on that at the end. that's the background. Yeah.
Other questions?
Hello, my name is Michael Kroll. As I have before, want to thank Dick Buxbaum for being my attorney 60 years ago. So my question really goes to both of you, and it has to do with the possibility, that this proto-fascist will be elected president next week, which is a possibility. And my question really has to do with what you think the appropriate response to that might be. I am 81 years old. You know, my intention is, well, I don't know what my intention is. Do I flee? Do I go to Czechoslovakia? Do I fight underground? Do I stay because, Dick, you say it's not going to be as bad as I think it's going to be? What is the appropriate response to the possible election of this very, very dangerous man?
I'm going to pass that to you. I've already said something.
It's a good question. I'm not sure I have the complete answer. I actually completely share Dick's feeling that he voiced before about it not being quite comparable to Germany. I do feel that our institutions are stronger. I think there is, and I say this partly because I spent some years for a recent book studying the United States in a very repressive period, the Red Scare of 1917 to 21, and where Congress passed the Espionage Act. The government used it to shut down completely 75 newspapers and magazines. It used it and copycat state laws and even local laws allowed roughly 1,000 Americans to be placed in prison for a year or more, and a much larger number for shorter periods, solely for things that they wrote or said. I think we have a stronger legal system today than we had then. I find it hard to imagine the courts tolerating something like that today. The lawyers here will have to correct me if I'm wrong, but the horrible as the Supreme Court is, I believe I'm right in saying that a majority of lower court judges, federal, district, and Court of Appeals judges have been appointed by Democrats. And so I don't think you have the kind of unified, easily controlled from the top court system that will allow the kind of repression that we saw in this country a little over 100 years ago. I also totally agree with what Dick said about the strength of the federal system. The fact that we have strong state governments that are not going to allow to happen everything that Trump would like to do. I certainly agree that there's a lot of terrible stuff that he would like to do, but I think he's going to run into resistance from the state governments, resistance from courts, at least at the level below the Supreme Court. Now, your real question was what we should all do if this terrible thing happens. Not an easy answer, but I think that the more you can be involved in politics at the local level, at the state level, getting the right people elected, the better. The press, institutions of journalism are going to need every possible support they can get. You've seen just in the last week or so how the owners of the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times have bowed to the possibility of Trump becoming elected by refusing to endorse and making up various excuses for that. This is intolerable. We need to support every conceivable type of independent-minded journalistic institution. And we need to keep on doing that. And we need to be vigilant. Other suggestions, Dick? Do you have some to add to that?
Well, again, it's federalism to me. The fact that unlike Germany, right, you have very strong states that are not going to be collapsing, with new leadership into a totalitarian system. What worries me more is really cultural and populist mass movements, or let's say a kind of uninhibited ways of moving dissent into violence here and there. I don't think we're going to have a civil war, but I do think we're going to have uncivil physical problems and not only discourse problems. But again, I don't see that in the cataclysmic sense. Also, we're in the wrong state. I mean, the place to think about this is Kansas. Forget Oklahoma. That'll go with whatever is said. But and the other thing is, of course, as many of us have tried, we've identified which House seats are possibly switchable to Democrats, and California happens to have 3 or 4 that are, and that's just as valuable, right, as going out somewhere and trying to get a Virginia district. There are clear districts in California that are switchable, that were not held very strongly by Republicans, right? And 3 will make the House different. I mean, that's important to see.
Another difference from Germany, just to add one more thing, is the role of the military in the US. I don't think you will see them going along passively with a Trump dictatorship. I think a lot of these generals are going to put their foot down if they're ordered to do things that are unconstitutional.
I hope so. I hope so. That's the Article 25 issue, and of course, it's been talked about even in the end of the last Trump administration, and it is something that can be handled. But we don't know who has been promoted up, and you don't know what the second rank of high officers, I mean, from the colonel rank up to lieutenant general, are going to think about this. There's certainly more in this kind of army we have today. I think there is a difference in terms of the spectrum of political views that wasn't the case in a drafted army.
So more questions.
I too was one of Dick's, in his defendant group. We were all broken up into groups of 4, or most of us were broken up into groups of 4, and then different attorneys had different people in different groups. You were talking about sort of the absurdity or the complexity of the trial. You mentioned that Frank Coakley didn't show up, but that meant that Ed Meese and Lowell Jensen did. And I just wonder if you had any inkling of either the quality or the horror of Ed Meese in dealing with him, or for that matter, that Lowell Jensen went on to have a decent reputation as a decent judge. And because I just remember sitting in the Veterans Hall and having contempt for both of these guys, and I just wonder if you had any inkling of where these people were going to wind up.
I had then, pardon me, and I have now a very great difference of opinion of Jensen and Meese. I mean, as of Jensen or of Meese. Meese was a soft, pudgy guy who wasn't a very good lawyer, and he didn't have very much to do in that trial. He was more of a bag carrier. Lowell Jensen really controlled the prosecution. He was always very straight, even during the trial. He would tell you in advance. There weren't going to be any, we never had a nasty surprise about some surprise witness, and so forth, coming in. And I got to know him better later, right? Of course, he even ended up being FBI director at the time. He was a straight shooter. I have no problem with that. Ed Meese, you could tell pretty quickly, was going to be in Reagan's camp. and of course he became the pardon attorney for Reagan. We also have to remember something a lot of people forget. Who was the governor when the free speech trial began? It wasn't Reagan, it was Pat Brown. Right? And he was very, very pissed when he wasn't allowed to speak on campus under the rules that the administration had set up, no partisan politics. He was running, for the governorship again, and he wasn't allowed to speak on campus. At that point, he washed his hands and refused to support the administration. Right? So the transition to Reagan was not a shell shock, because Pat Brown already had kind of said the hell with the university. His amour propre was hurt.
Other questions?
Moving away from the historical elements of the free speech movement to now, I have a lot of concern about what we might consider the limitations on free speech, and particularly political speech, when we have now the kind of social media that we have, and the extent of the, quote, alternative facts, and the intense amount of lying that goes on, that I think put us into a whole other category of what we need to be talking about in terms of how our discourse goes, and what's tolerable, and where we maybe need to be looking at some lines on our free speech that we don't seem to have right now, and that can be causing great harm. Where's the tension between our freedom and the harm to our freedom?
Well, I'll give that one to you.
Well, there are a lot of things to unpack in that comment. For one thing, who gets to speak, right? I mean, money talks. Poor people generally don't, at least not in terms where they are heard. The whole issue of the loss of media, right? The move to Twitters and tweets, and I don't even know the name of all these things. I'm too old. I don't know how to tap into them on my computer. Those all are new, right? So the amount of nonsense that is spewed, it may not be much different from nonsense that was spewed 100 or even 150 years ago in terms of its substance, but it certainly travels around more quickly and reaches more people. I was once in 1948, I think, at a meeting in rural Kentucky. I was on my way back up during my draft days, and the kind of conversations being held there, like polio was a problem that happened because your head got hit by your daddy or something. I remember that actually as one example. I mean, nonsense exists everywhere, but that stuff never traveled. I mean, you had its own pocket. Today, every bit of nonsense hits everybody. That's the difference, and that's the problem.
So, no, I'll let your comment. I like that idea that nonsense has always been there, but it travels much more rapidly today. In fact, I'm going to steal that line the next time somebody asks me about this. We're well past 6:30 when we're supposed to end. How about one more question, and then we call it a day?
So let's flash back to before December in Sproul Hall. Let's talk, if you would, about the precursor when the university said you couldn't sit at a table on campus unless you were a student. And a non-student was at a table. The police came to arrest him because he wouldn't move. And there was the students surrounded and slept all night around the police car. That was in early October of '64. Connect that
Yeah.
going forward?
Well, this again is, from my point of view, an issue of how the university administration, didn't know its ass from its elbow in this context. The way they handled that, right, was so muddled and stupid. I remember very well those tapes. I wasn't a big activist at the time, but I would go down and chat with people. And the effort to seize leaflets and so on was so hard. And also, Fran, remember, a lot of students had been blooded by then by other experiences, not just the freedom riders, who had gone south and had the experience they did, but locally, when HUAC came to San Francisco, when the Hinks department store was boycotted, and so on, when the Sheraton Hotel was occupied, because they wouldn't hire, that was a matter of hiring Negroes in the context of the day, right? A lot of students had good experiences with that and were not too afraid of showing up and being perky, right? And so when the administration is stupid and gives you chances, it certainly makes a difference. And I do think that October day when Jack Weinstein was immured in that police car and then it was surrounded was a wonderful thing. And you may remember, you've seen pictures of it, how polite the protesters were. Everybody took their shoes off when they got up to stand on top of the police car, right? He was passed a milk bottle so he could urinate, because he was in there 3 days. Good thing he hadn't eaten too much. But you're right. That was a turning point, right? From then on, it was steam ahead, full steam ahead. Yeah.
Also, one more thing.
Yeah.
Berkeley in those days was the mayor, etc. It was a Republican city.
We have to remember that. We have to remember that. The mayor was Republican. De Bonis was, of course, even a more Republican, right? That's important to know. You couldn't, why do you think International House was founded? Because people of color couldn't find rooms to rent in Berkeley. That was the main reason why it came to Berkeley. Now, when it started in New York, the Rockefellers had some different ideas. Here, that was the main thing. The I House became a fist punch into the culture of that day in 1929.
So maybe we've made some progress. Anyway, well, thank you very much, Dick, for sharing your wisdom with us. And thank all of you for coming, and especially those of you who are free speech movement veterans.